Good evening and welcome to our special show tonight, looking at the IMF's new World Economic Forecast. Joining me tonight is Gita Gopinath, Chief Economist of the IMF and, of course, author of that report. Thank you very much for joining me, Gita Gopinath. It's great to have you on the show. You've said in this report that... Thank you. You said in this report that this crisis, like no other, will have a recovery like no other. Could you perhaps explain what you meant by that and what have been the biggest changes that have struck you from the April outlook to today?
Yes, so I would first flag that if you look at the first half of this year, you have that's when you had the deepest contraction. So we are projecting a very deep contraction in many economies right now, but this is the first half of this year was where we saw the biggest brunt of it. And now we're seeing reopening and you're seeing a spurt in activity. So this is the first thing, which is like a recovery like no other, which is that usually when you have major contractions, it can be a slow process for the recovery. But because these are lockdowns and reopening, we're seeing a quick recovery. But at the same time, because the health crisis is not over and you could have future waves, there's tremendous uncertainty. So the recovery might start out being quick, but will be prolonged in our opinion. And at the same time, it will hit sectors very differently. So there will be contact-intensive sectors like leisure, hospitality, tourism, travel. I mean, those will be impacted for a long time as long as this health crisis is still there.
You've, in a sense, compared what's happening today that the world will not see, hasn't seen a recession like this since the Great Depression. Also, the interesting points you made about health and the economy now being so closely intertwined. Earlier reasons for recessions have often been linked to more financial factors, economic factors. This is a very different kind of recession given the reasons. Are we going to see a complete change in what our economic focus and priorities are related to health?
I think this is absolutely going to happen and across the globe. Like you said, this is a crisis where the shock is a health shock. And frankly, we don't even know how long the shock is going to last and what shape it will take. So there is tremendous uncertainty on that front. And if you look at how it's impacting economies, even if you look at very open economies that rely on exports and so on, for them, most of the hit is coming domestically. So this is a crisis that's going to call for much bigger investment in health infrastructure in countries around the world. Make sure that there is a wide safety net in the sense that people can afford healthcare and have access to healthcare. And this will be an important investment that countries will have to make.
And of course, at a time when the world was looking more global than ever before in the terms of international markets, etc., now it's actually a time when we saw so many closed borders, cutting down on travel. Now, that's all will have an economic impact in terms of, do you think, international trade as well? What do you see as the long-term implications of the almost reverse of globalization in one sense?
So so this health crisis is necessitating the closing of borders for people to move across as opposed to goods. And as long as you have hotspots anywhere in the world, I think that will persist for a while. So this obviously, will restrict tourism for countries, and there are countries that rely almost entirely on tourism, and for them this is a big hit, a prolonged hit. But in terms of what this implies for globalization more generally, I think we have to keep pushing and making the argument that trade in goods has helped people around the world. Trade in services has helped people around the world. It has helped with raising productivity, job creation at a global level. And so, while countries might be rethinking globalization or might be deciding to localize production for not the right reasons, I think they should keep in mind that there have been tremendous benefits from globalization.
It's interesting, of course, because you say that at a time when President Trump has put a stop to all work visas till the end of the year because the focus, he says, on giving people jobs, Americans who need those jobs. You've seen also earlier what President Trump had announced on trade tariffs with China. And of course, India and China are currently in a very different situation where economic issues or economic tariffs may well be on the table as well. So do you see that now perhaps inter-country tensions, you've seen other countries calling for an investigation into China's role in the pandemic. What impact is that going to have? It's interesting, of course, that China is the only country which your forecast shows as having positive growth?
I mean, there are risks. So in terms of when we list out the risks to our forecast, we mentioned trade tensions and geopolitical tensions as being one of the important ones for precisely the reason that you mentioned, which is we are seeing this happening around the world. That is a major concern. I mean, in the very near term, a major concern for us was countries putting restrictions on medical exports. And we called for that reversal. A lot of that has happened, but still more needs to be done. When treatments are made available and vaccines actually are finally there, again, to make sure that it's globally available and it can be produced at scale and sold everywhere, I mean, that will require global cooperation. So, this is a crisis, it's a global crisis that's not going to be solved locally, and which is why globalization, global cooperation, global integration is very important. And, we highlight that, and our hope is that will, that countries will make sure that they remain integrated.
Do you think that applies to work visas as well, or the H-1B visas, just such a huge issue for Indians, as we know, major beneficiaries of those visas?
I mean, again, like I said, many countries are reassessing their policies in terms of, trade, goods trade, services trade, people flow, people moving around. And I mean, at least in the case of immigration, I think what we can say is that pretty much all of the evidence, and especially if you look at high-skilled immigration, almost all of the evidence points to the fact that it's beneficial for the country receiving these high-skilled immigrants. It's very, very beneficial.
So just looking perhaps more specifically at the forecast, you've said that India likely to contract by minus 4.5%, but you predict a robust growth perhaps in 2021, a 6% growth. China, as I said, is still reflected as positive growth. Just some of the analysis of what went into the India growth specifically, and then perhaps we can look at why China is a bright spot at the moment.
So in the case of India, and I'm going to just make sure that when you add up the numbers, if you look at our growth projection for 2020 and add up the growth projection for 21, I mean, over 2 years, we are basically saying growth in India over a 2-year period will be slightly over 1%. So, that is not a very strong growth picture. But again, this is similar to many other countries around the globe. In terms of where the recovery will come from, first, it just starts from the fact that we have will be incredibly deep downturn in India this year. And as you have reopening and as the health crisis abates and as the global economy recovers, India will also recover. And that's the path. But this is still well below the path that was projected before this crisis hit. In the case of China, China is one of the countries, actually, yes, it's among the larger economies. It's the one with positive growth. Hard to find another one. And their recovery is also one of the strongest. And I think this reflects the fact that they've just had a much quicker success in containing the virus, needing briefer containment periods. And you see the recovery is well underway, across the board now in China.
What do you think are the specific challenges the Indian economy faces at this current time? You mentioned, of course, challenges we were facing before this pandemic as well. But given that now, I mean, we are, of course, India gradually reopening its economy, but also at the same time battling with the huge rise in cases. I mean, we are one amongst the top 4 countries in the world currently in growth of cases. What do you think are the specific challenges we face today?
So I think the main challenge right now is the health crisis, and for some of the reasons you just mentioned, in terms of the cases going up. But again, let's just put it in some perspective, which is if you look at cases per capita, still India is very low. The concern, of course, is the trajectory of it. So there is a health crisis, and for India, this is obviously compounded in a couple of ways. One is a far more dense population, which makes it harder for social distancing to work. And secondly, in terms of health capacity. So while in terms of, number of hospital beds per capita, doctors per capita, I mean, India is, it has improved over time, but still is far from the international average. Now, what India has done very well is on contact tracing, which is a very important piece of this, of dealing with this crisis. And so that has helped. The second vulnerability for India is on the financial front, which is even before this crisis hit, you had the financial sector that had its troubles, both the bank, non-bank, housing corporations, all of that. And with this crisis, with the collapse in activity that we're seeing, this could become again another source of that dampens the recovery going forward.
Mm-hmm. The Prime Minister said in a recent speech that we should look also at how we can convert a crisis into an opportunity. He launched, of course, the Atmanirbhar or self-reliance push. We've seen India globally has a huge reputation for a manufacturer of generic drugs. And looking at a new Made in India push, what do you think are the big opportunities that for India today at a time like this?
Oh, I mean, when you think of opportunities, I think what obviously comes to mind is, at least going forward, is for India to be a bigger player in global value chains. It has made bigger inroads in the export sector. It has diversified its export basket, but it certainly can have a bigger role in international trade. Mm-hmm. And that's one area in which it needs to do, but that would require significant reforms because ultimately the Indian firm size is quite small and the productivity, if you look at the average productivity, is not that high. So those will have to be addressed. Secondly, of course, India has done very well on the digital front, mm-hmm. And that has helped even in terms of the social safety net, as we saw this time around, and expanding on that. Similarly, much more on the health front in terms of medical care, medical facilities. I mean, that will be an important, another important area for attention. Mm-hmm. And I think more generally for India, accelerating the pace of needed reform and needed change would help. I mean, there are many things that need to be done. We see there was an announcement for reforms in the agricultural sector, and that's certainly welcome. Mm-hmm. Much more needs to be done on the financial sector front in terms of governance, in terms of risk management. So I think there is the bucket of things that need to be done are quite clear and have been quite clear. Mm-hmm. The hope is that this crisis will trigger an acceleration in the speed with which it is done.
For India, of course, one major fallout of the health crisis was a humanitarian one. And we saw, of course, about a few weeks ago, the pictures of thousands and thousands of migrant workers now actually just walking home in the worst circumstances. How can we actually change this? Just looking at our labor force, the fact that a majority of our labor force is in the informal sector. How do we now look at, we know that employment actually went up, rural employment, because of a welfare scheme, Manrega. Do you think this is also a chance to look at our welfare economy and look perhaps at more schemes like these in rural areas, in states where workers actually come from, rather than this large-scale migration from state to state?
So the migration that we've seen in India, of course, reflects the fact that we've had very differential economic growth across the different parts of India. Mm-hmm. And so, by having much more of a uniform growth across the country, of course, that would help. Now, the migrants were very badly hit during this period. I mean, on the one hand, because of the health crisis, there was a desire to keep them, where they were. But on the other hand, you saw that, many people were moving back to their homes. Mm-hmm. Now, the government has helped recently in terms of with transportation and food and shelter. Mm-hmm. But I think you can very well see a scenario where the migrant worker doesn't want to come back mm-hmm. To the city where it worked and stay at home. So then the question is, how do you deal with that? I think one, of course, is to ensure that there are economic opportunities at the local level to absorb the workers, at least in this transition time before they are comfortable going elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And this would require also collaboration across state governments and local authorities to help with ease with which they can get reabsorbed into the workforce, the ability of them to move across the borders. I think that's very important. And, you need to provide continued support, both, in-kind support, cash support to migrant workers during these very difficult times.
Do you think, because this, of course, is being debated politically as well, do you think cash in hand is a good idea at this time? Do you think welfare schemes like Manrega are the need of the hour, need to be expanded and strengthened? Universal ration scheme, what do you think are the welfare schemes which are urgently needed at this time?
I think both cash transfers and in-kind transfers, which include food, cooking gas, household staples, are needed this time around. And in terms of, cash transfers, what we have seen, the evidence is that you have, this has a very positive impact on economic activity, because you have people who are able to maintain basic spending and make sure they have their basic needs. And that will be very helpful for the recovery. So I would say a combination of cash and in-kind transfers.
Right. Of course, also one interesting aspect has shown up, because India, of course, is with its many states, Uttar Pradesh, for instance, has just the population of Europe, that the different state models, and of course, Kerala is a state, you know well, you were a former advisor to the government there. Kerala's health model has really been talked about internationally. Do you think that this is now a time for us to look much more at our spending on health, spending on education? The AAP has tried to focus on that in Delhi, but of course a lot left to be done in states across the country. Do you think this is a time when we look at states where they spend more on aspects like health and education actually makes a huge economic difference? Is that what you think is the big lesson India and its states need to learn from this?
I mean, it is a very important lesson. I think there is no doubt that much more health capacity is needed. If you look at the number of, again, like hospital beds per capita, doctors per capita in India, there is room for improving those numbers quite substantially. I mean, another lesson from Kerala, which has done extremely well in dealing with this health crisis, is the strength of their local governance and the local communities. And that is also something that I think, you know, when applied more widely would really help, because this is a crisis where when you have those kinds of very strong local organizations, you're able to deal with it much better.
Did you find also that when we look at, because for India, of course, one of the big worries is that it's our commercial centers which are the hardest hit, whether it's Mumbai, whether it's Surat, whether it's in Tamil Nadu, which have been hardest hit by the crisis. They were also the states with the worst safety nets for workers from outside, and health facilities seemed overdone. So in that sense, economic centers really need to focus much more on what was seen as just social factors earlier as well. Are you worried about the GDP impact because so many of our commercial cities are still battling this virus?
I mean, the reason for our downgrade is, I mean, this is one of the big reasons for it. It's because of the fact that the major cities are still battling the virus. Lockdowns, you know, are being extended, and that absolutely has an immediate effect on activity. To your other point about social safety nets, I think this will be I hope one of the positive legacies of this crisis. The two big positive legacies will be, one, on the medical front and on the health front, making sure healthcare is more widely available. And the second is just a more broader social safety net for, you know, ensuring basic livelihoods. And both of this would be required.
Right. And do you find also, because in India, somehow we find that the economy often becomes a kind of political ball back and forth. So when a ratings agency downgrades an India forecast, that's seen as the opposition seizes on it. When it upgrades an India forecast, the government seizes on it. How do we get economics, or maybe the hard facts on GDP and forecasts, out of the whole political issue that has become in India?
Well, that's true globally that this happens. But I think firstly, yes, the numbers are severe. At minus 4.5%, that's a severe, you know, negative for a country that's projected otherwise to be at around 6.5% growth. But that is true pretty much across the world. I mean, let me give you the example of the US. The US is typically projected to grow at 2%, and this year we have it at minus 8%. So these are difficult times, and I think it's very important for everybody to work together to come out of this crisis and to have a recovery that then can generate the kinds of jobs that will be needed going forward and the kinds of incomes that will be needed. I mean, it's just, these are very difficult times, and there has to be kind of agile, vigilant policy response, and from everybody.
And just a few years ago, the IMF had described India as the one bright spot in the global economy. How would you describe India today?
Well, India still is a country that has a potential growth rate of 6.5%, and that is, given the size of the economy, that is still an outlier in terms of potential growth. Well, most advanced economies are projected to be at sub 2% growth. So that India still has tremendous potential. I think what is absolutely needed now is to have the right policies in place, and many steps have been taken. Get the reform agenda going. And make sure that the recovery is durable and quick.
And of course, coming back to China and India, the two largest markets in the world, and many have pointed to the fact that some companies wanting to move out of China could be a golden opportunity for India. Yet we see Vietnam, etc., coming up as preferred destinations in some cases. How does India becomes, say, the new investment destination for the world? Do you think this is possible?
I think India becomes the new investment destination for the world when it becomes also the best investment destination for its domestic industry. So it's the same kinds of policies that would encourage, domestic investment would be the ones that would encourage international investment, be it land reforms, labor market reforms, improved governance, in which India has, of course, done quite well. But I mean, all of these better infrastructure, this is both, in terms of, not just electricity, but in terms of ports. I mean, all of those measures will be needed.
Right. And finally, Gita Gopinath, of course, is someone who's born in India, studied in India, knows India so well. What would be your final thoughts, would I say words of advice perhaps for the Indian government or the Prime Minister to Prime Minister Modi?
I would say that if you looked at the aggregate set of measures that have been taken on the monetary, fiscal, financial front, they have been substantial. India has done very well in terms of contact tracing, but a lot more needs to be done. I would say on the following fronts: one, increasing the testing capacity in India. Second, I think some more on budget spending would also help, which is more direct cash and in-kind support for especially more vulnerable people and also for SMEs. That would be another major shift. And then the third is to, recognize that coming out of this crisis would be an opportunity to strengthen reforms going forward, and to have a very holistic approach to the India development strategy, which involves more job creation, higher raising per capita incomes. I mean, so that would be my basic advice.
Gita Gopinath, thank you very much for joining us tonight. It was wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you.